All right. Hello, everyone, and happy Wednesday. Welcome to our Healthy Homes and Home Performance talk today about insulation. So, last week we talked about air sealing and why it is important. And so now today we will talk about insulation for existing homes and things you can do in your home just to check to see if insulation is there and identify how well it is or how well it was installed and how what the current condition is. So if you have a house with a slab foundation, then that the insulation, if there is any under there, you won't really be able to check that because it's covered up by the slab. More typical, you might have a crawl space foundation, so that is basically a framed floor with a cavity of space underneath it between the floor and the ground. So that can vary between, barely any space to a few feet of space. So depending on your house, you might be able to get under there and check the insulation. You might be able to access the space via an internal access point. Maybe that's in a closet somewhere or like a little hatch in the floor somewhere, or outside through the foundation wall. So you'll just have to, if you don't know if you have an access point, just check around the outside of your house or maybe in your closets and see if there is a hatch that you can open to get in there. Again, if you are going to go out and visually inspect, make sure you have personal protective equipment such as safety goggles, face mask, and maybe even a Tyvek suit or clothes you don't mind getting dirty. So, and just be aware when you are going into spaces around your house, underneath and in the attic. It's sometimes, there might be critters in there. I've definitely encountered some in the past. So just be aware. You might encounter those or possible moisture conditions and that kind of thing. So just be aware if you are starting to explore those spaces that those are some potential things you might encounter other than your floor framing and your insulation or your attic. We'll get to that later. But so for a framed floor, you will likely have fiberglass batt insulation installed between the floor joists. So that's pretty typical. Oftentimes, depending on the age of the house and when the insulation got installed, it might be sagging down, or maybe different critters got in there and started tearing it apart and making, using that insulation as their bedding. So, yeah, just check to see if the bats are still in between the joists, and if you also gloves for personal protective equipment. So you want to make sure there's no, so if the insulation is still there in between the joists, it's not sagging down. The other thing to check for is if there is an air gap between the insulation and the subfloor. So you can reach up around the fiberglass bat and check. You can either pull it back and kind of like see what's going on, or you can kind of gauge if there is any kind of gap between the insulation and the floor. So you don't want a gap, because if there is a gap between the insulation and the floor, that means that there are convective currents of air that can move through that space, and then that in turn makes your floor more uncomfortable, and the insulation just isn't as effective at doing its job. So you might not have any insulation in your floor, and that might be why your floors are cold. So a lot of these comfort concerns in homes come from lack of insulation and air sealing, or just poor quality of the current state of it. So if you are noticing in different parts of your homes that your floors are uncomfortable, your it gets really hot upstairs, that might be because you are lacking insulation and air sealing, or well installed, let's say, lacking well installed insulation and air sealing. So in your crawl space, so if you have no insulation there, or your fiberglass bats are in poor condition, they're falling down, it might be time to install new insulation. So depending on your interest level and comfort level of doing your own self-install, it is possible to do, especially like a crawl space. You can go out to your local home improvement store and get fiberglass bat insulation and make sure it is, at least I'd say at least R30, R38 is better. And get those fiberglass bats and then install it. So one thing to know about installation is you want to make sure that your bats will, again, like not sag in the future. So you can install them in the cavity, and then you can add underneath, like at the bottom of the floor joist, you can add things like twine, like stapling twine to the joist, or you can have like wood lath strips to help prevent the bats from falling down. There's also these like wire, sort of like kind of like a rainbow, like a spring that can help. You can put that between the joists and it helps push the bat up, so there's not that air gap. So there's a lot of different, or not a lot, but several different solutions that you can use to help make sure your bats are going to be installed in a way that they will stay in place over time. So definitely want to make sure, if you're going to spend the money on the material, that you get it installed well. And that's also just some good things to know if you decide to hire a contractor. So there are different levels of installation quality with insulation. And so if you are hiring someone, these are some things to look for to make sure that you have a quality job and that your insulation will be performing in a way that makes your home more comfortable and efficient. So that's floors, crawl spaces, and then walls. So for an existing home, most typically, unless you're doing a major remodel and opening up wall cavities or taking off siding, the main option is going to be a drill and fill insulation option. So that means, depending on the type of siding, if you have tongue and groove or some kind of siding that you can't really take off, like one row at a time, you might have to drill directly through the siding into the wall cavity in each stud bay. So there'll basically be a hole every 16 inches or so. And generally there's like a high point and a low point hole in each level of the house. So if you have a single story house, you would have horizontally, you'd have a hole every stud bay, so every 16 inches, and then vertically you'd have two, like one lower down the cavity, one higher up. So, a good amount of holes that eventually will get plugged once the insulation is done, will get plugged and sealed. So, like situations where you have tongue and groove siding and you have to drill through the siding and then plug it back up and fill it. So it's really important to have like a painter who, if you're going to repaint your house, it's a good idea to do this right before you're going to repaint your house. So having a good painter that can make sure that those holes won't show up over time is really important. So that's just kind of a special case when you can't take off the siding. The other typical way you can do a drill and fill is you remove a row of siding, or if you have like a cedar shake, you can just remove a few shakes in certain spots, and then you can actually just drill into whatever the underlayment is. So that might be OSB or plywood, or just like the single, like the, what do they call it, skip sheathing, I think. But just like several, before they had sheet goods, they used just like lots of strips of wood. So you're just drilling through that, and then you're putting the siding back on, and it's just not as obvious. So you might have to do a little touch-up paint there. So if you're not thinking about repainting your house, that can be a good, and you have that type of siding, that can be a good option. So, and generally this is going to be best to hire a contractor for, because they have the right equipment and they know how to measure the density of the insulation that is getting installed. The other thing I want to say, in addition to drilling and filling from the outside, you can do it from the inside. So if you have situations where maybe you have tongue and groove siding and you don't want to drill through the outside, or you have siding that might have lead-based paint, or like different materials like asbestos siding that can be more potentially more costly to do remediation on, you might want to do your insulation from the inside. So it's a little bit more invasive, especially if you were living there. So if you can find somewhere else to be for a couple of days, depending on how big your house is, they might be able to do it in one day, but just a short period, then it might be better from the inside so that you can dense pack the walls from the inside or the outside. And typically the types of insulation are either fiberglass or cellulose. So either one of those. Generally, fiberglass is considered better because you don't have the potential mold concerns that you might have with cellulose, even though it is treated. So fiberglass is more resistant to rot and mold. So that's walls. If you are taking off the siding and you're residing your house, it could be also a good opportunity to add an exterior layer of insulation. So like some kind of rigid foam or like a rock wool, I forget what they call it. There's like a board. It's not the bat. There's a kind of a board. It's called comfort board insulation. So you can, which has good fire resistance properties. So you can add that to the outside and then add your siding. So yeah. And then attics. So if you have a regular, just a flat ceiling at the top of your home, then you have like a sort of a vented attic space where, there's a triangle shape, and on the floor of the attic, there might be bad insulation or blown in or nothing, depending on how old the house is and if any work has been done since it was built. So attics are another good place for blown in insulation because it really can help fill around like all of the rafters and any penetrations that are going through the attic. So sometimes there's ductwork up there and there's like a lot of little things to work around. And so if you're installing like fiberglass bata insulation up there, it's just not as easy to do in a way that makes it well installed. So, and attic insulation blown in is pretty inexpensive if you hire someone to do that. So again, make sure you do the air sealing part first and then do insulation. If you have existing insulation up there, it's, you can do your research and talk to a contractor if you're hiring one to see if it makes sense to remove that existing insulation, or if you just move it around to do your air sealing and get all that done and then add new insulation on top of that. So generally it's kind of expensive to remove insulation that's up there, especially if it's like a blown in. If it's bats, it's maybe a little easier, and especially you might have an exterior attic access, so that makes it a little bit cleaner in your house, so you don't have to be dragging out insulation like through the house if you have an exterior access point. So yeah, and then blowing in generally fiberglass up there as well. So a lot of fiberglass. Sometimes you can do these things with cellulose. If you are doing bat insulation, fiberglass is generally the cheapest. I like the mineral wool insulation because it adds some fire resistive properties. Generally, there's not like a blown in option, but I feel like I have heard of that lately. So they might be coming out with a new technology to be able to blow that in. So generally the mineral wool is a bat insulation that you can install between stud bays or floor joists, or if you have a vaulted ceiling, if you're turning your attic space into a conditioned attic, if you have enough headroom up there for that, then you could potentially install mineral wool insulation against the roof. Well, before you do that, you should do some kind of closed cell foam. Do a few inches of closed cell foam against the roof deck, and then you can do batt insulation. Again, depending on what part of the country you're in. Here in the Pacific Northwest, it's generally recommended to do about 3 inches of closed cell foam, and then you can either blow in the rest of the cavity with blown in insulation or add some kind of batt insulation. So, because you want to, in a vaulted ceiling, if you're going to do an unvented space, then you want to have some kind of closed cell foam against the roof deck, so that you're not going to have potential water vapor building up on the sheathing and then causing rot and other water related issues there. So if you can do a vented vaulted ceiling as well. So you just use some kind of like spacer material that gives you an inch or two of air gap between your insulation and the sheathing, and then you can have a vented cavity there. So lots of different options, and there's, do your research. You're always welcome to reach out to me if you're thinking about doing any insulation upgrades to help improve the comfort of your home and help save money on your bills. So, and there's also some, depending on where you are, your utilities might have incentive programs to help you pay for some of those upgrades, not only for homeowners, but also for rental properties. So check in with your local utilities and see if they have any upgrade options available, as far as, maybe it's like 30 cents a square foot or something like that. So it's just a random number, but something like that where you can help you pay for your upgrades in your home. So yeah, I think that's it for now. And I will be back here next Wednesday, and I'll have another topic for you. So I think we're going to keep doing these through June, and then we'll see if we continue to have more topics to talk about. I might run out of things to talk about, but again, just let me know if you have questions about your home. So that's what I do, is I do home energy consulting for new and existing homes. And, I can do this virtually during this time via phone call or Zoom chat, that kind of thing. So just let me know. Okay. All right. Thanks. Bye for now.